Nearly 30 young Somali men have now been murdered in 4 years in Alberta in a suspected drug trade within the cultural group. Somalis say it is a Canadian problem, not a Somali one. The killings are disturbing to everyone and have spurred debate that our province and nation are not doing enough to help new Canadians integrate. As Statistics Canada reveals 1 in 3 Canadians will be a visible minority within 20 years, what attitudes do cultural groups face in Alberta? Are we doing enough to help all cultures share a place in our society? And who is responsible for solving issues within cultural communities?
And to bring us the frontline perspective, Suzanne Gross, Director of Settlement and Immigration at the Edmonton Mennonite Centre for Newcomers, Joanne Meinecker, a criminologist from Grant MacEwan University, and in Toronto this evening, Ahmed Hussen, National President of the Canadian Somali Congress. Welcome to Alberta Prime Time, everyone.
Thank you.
Ahmed, address the belief for us among some Albertans that young Somali men are not integrated into mainstream society enough, and that's part of the reason for this series of murders. Is that really the problem?
Well, I think it's a manifestation of a larger issue, which is the failure of our system to fully integrate Canadians who might be the children of immigrants. I must emphasize, though, that the vast majority of the young men who've died in Alberta are not immigrants. They're actually born in Canada, and their parents were immigrants to Canada, but they have been born and raised, for the most part, in Canada.
So then how can you say that if the people involved in these murders are second, third generation Canadians, that we're not at the same time doing a good enough job integrating newcomers? It sounds...
Well, yeah. But that's your wording. I continually talk about integration of Canadians into the mainstream. I'm not talking about integration of newcomers, because I think that is a misdiagnosis of the problem.
So you mean third generation?
Yeah, because their parents needed to be, their parents were newcomers and they needed to be settled into Canada. So they needed immigrant settlement services. But these young people do not need immigrant settlement services. What they need is integration and equality into the mainstream. And a lot of them are not getting access to professions and jobs that they went to school for. And that breeds some alienation. The extreme example is obviously those that end up in the wrong line of work. But for the most part, it's not, to me, the issue isn't, obviously the deaths are tragic enough, but the issue transcends the deaths and points to a larger problem of a lack of integration of Canadians of minority backgrounds.
Okay, I want to bring up a board actually from a January Leger marketing poll and ask one of our guests, Suzanne Gross, about her take on it. When Leger Marketing asked Canadians recently if they believed in racial profiling of newcomers for security reasons, in Quebec 30% believed we need it. In and around half of those in other provinces are in favor. In Alberta, a whopping 70% of Albertans believing racial profiling of immigrants needed for security. Suzanne, you're a director at the Edmonton Mennonite Centre for Newcomers. What does that statistic say about what kind of reception Albertans are giving, whether it's new Canadians or third-generation visible minorities?
Well, that is a whopping number, and it makes me, well, it confirms for me the sort of reception that newcomers get in mainstream services that they might be looking for. And that's a huge part of the integration process, is feeling comfortable and trusting of mainstream service providers. And if 70% of our population is fearful in some way of newcomers, then that's not happening.
Right. Joanne, you're the criminologist. Make sense of all this for us.
I mean, it's a similar theme that I've been on talking about before, I think, about an us and them, and there's a lot of perhaps labeling and stigmatization when you do hear of these types of horrific crimes that are visible about a certain group. I think that what both of the panelists are saying about integration, though, is important, but not specifically just for visibly minority groups, but all youth, and trying to find a place and space. And unfortunately for some, that place and space that they carve out for themselves is in delinquent and criminal activities. So I think moving to other sorts of sites for them, whether that be community centers or more recreation programs or more cultural diverse recreation programs that really speak to the needs of particular communities, but then also attracting all youth so that they can mingle and they can mix with different groups and realize that he's just like me, she's just like me, even though maybe our skin is different or maybe we're of a different gender or a different age.
So Ahmed, who are you looking to help things, to change things? Is it the cultural groups, or is it Canadians who are welcoming newcomers, welcoming visible minorities, even if they are third-generation citizens?
Well, it's a bit of both, but before I get into that, the previous guest just talked about the previous speaker talked about how all youth need integration services to keep them away from criminal activity. But I have to submit here that even though the need she's right in the sense that the need is there within all youth, it's even more acute with visible minority youth. And I'll give you one example. In the city of Edmonton, if you're a visible minority group, the most you can apply for funding for youth services is $5,000. Why? Because there's a box which you put in called emerging refugee and immigrant communities. Even if you've been in Alberta for hundreds of years, if you're a visible minority, you're classified as an emerging immigrant community. Well, how long does it take to emerge? How long do you get taken seriously as a mainstream community? Whereas for the non-visible minority groups, you can apply to much more resources to integrate your youth to deal with those issues. Coming back to your other question with respect to whose responsibility it is, I'll take the example of the Canadian Somali community. They're doing the heavy lifting. They've done 80% of the work. They're putting together a mentorship project. They have successfully been able to get through the message to the community that they have to work with the police. And Edmonton Police Service is on record as commending the Canadian Somali community for not only working with police, but being actually ahead of other communities. So we're doing the heavy lifting, but we need allies and we need buy-in from the mainstream, and we need to be integrated as Canadian citizens and not as newcomers or immigrants. Because to be honest with you, the immigrants from the Canadian Somali community immigrating into Canada have trickled. It's a very small number. The vast majority of Canadian Somalis that you see in Alberta and in Ontario have been here for 3 decades or have been born here. So there's no such thing as newcomers when you talk about the Canadian Somali community for the most part.
When Alberta Prime Time returns with our panel, more on this topic, and we want to know